Lovely to see you all here. I'm Edward Davis. I'm the Director of Policy here at the CSJ, so I haven't met you before. Nice to meet you. First thing is some thank yous. It's my job. So thank you firstly to all you lot for coming. Thank you for our panel here, who we're going to hear a bit more from in a minute. Particular thank you to those of you that work with us, and as members of our board here, supporters, partners, so really thank you for all you do, because actually this is nothing without you. And a particular thank you to those of you who got our awards last night. I'm conscious that some of you I actually have already seen this morning in very small hours. So to you, well done. But actually the awards is quite a nice place for us to start today. So last night, our awards, we honour small charities who are doing exciting things on the front line. So a lot of charities that we saw last night were working with kids in gangs, they were working with ex-offenders, they were trying to find people long-term unemployed to find them a job, and they were really inspiring. And we did think, should we really be doing a launch next day? But we thought actually this is perfect, because this is one of those groups that really needs to be addressed. When you look through this report later, and Rory will talk us through the details, some of the statistics in here will not be new to you, but every time you hear them, they are absolutely jaw-dropping. So I just wanted to share a couple of them before we start. About half of the women in our prisons were abused as a child, and a similar number observed violence in the home as a child. Slightly over half are identified as suffering from both anxiety and depression, and only a slightly smaller number have attempted suicide. We are talking about a seriously vulnerable group, and so we're really pleased that we are getting to grips with this at the CSJ. But there is also some good news on this as well, which is why we're tackling it, is that actually the number of women in our prisons right now is just under 4,000. To put that in context, Nottingham Academy, school not a million miles from here, has almost that many pupils. There are 6 churches within 2 miles of this building with a congregation about the same size as the number of women in our prisons. And I grew up in Birkenhead, the home of the mighty Tranmere Rovers, and you could fit the entire population of our prisons, women's prisons, inside one stand at Prenton Park. This is not an insurmountable problem that we have. This is something that we actually can get to grips with. And so that's exactly what we're doing today. We're saying, do you know what, we're going to try and get to grips with this straight up. So it's a real pleasure to have, first up, the poor man who is charged with doing this for our country, Dr. Phillip Lee. Actually, before I let him speak, I must read, I was not going to do huge introductions, but this morning I did actually print off the remit of his work, which I can't find now, but I have it on my phone. And I thought I would read this out, just to give you an idea of how unstraightforward this job is right now. So, under Dr. Lee's jurisdiction is victims, domestic abuse, female offenders, youth justice, offender health, coroners, burials, inquests and inquiries, the land review, race disparity audit, devolved administrations, devolution, PCCs, human rights, lawfare, mental capacity in the Office of Public Guardian, transgender offenders and veterans. And I don't think that's exhaustive. But I think it says a lot that in all that he is here this morning and is going to share a few words with us about what's going on down the road at the MOJ.
Well, thank you for that generous introduction. It's a wonder with that list of things whether I actually fit to go out of the office and have a life outside. And apologies for not attending what sounds like a fantastic event last night. Unfortunately, my wife took a tumble down the stairs on, when was it? Monday afternoon. So I had to go to St Thomas's with her. And she's no longer sort of mobile, so I have an 8-month-old, and so it would have been a bit of a push to say, oh, by the way, I'm off to the Centre for Social Justice Awards, so I had to pull out, so apologies for my non-attendance. It's fantastic to be the Centre for Social Justice. I remember when your organisation was launched, 2004 is I think, off the top of my head, and I used to come along as a budding politician on the candidates list to many of your events actually, because I thought it was an area that was about time that there was a think tank that was looking at these areas in the sort of depth that I could see that the centre was doing, so it's a real honour to be here, because I used to be out there looking at the then ministers and shadow ministers or whatever making speeches, and I wondered if I'd ever get to be here with a long list of responsibilities in a ministry, and sort of discovering on a daily basis the frustrating inertia of Whitehall and Westminster, and wondering to myself why it is that things take so long to happen, why decisions take so long. And it's a broader point I'd make actually, and this applies to CSJ across all the things that you do. Looking at how government works, how it functions, how it actually arrives at decisions, the timeliness of decisions, how it looks at financing across the piece. Does it look at it in a sort of year-on-year basis, or does it actually say to itself, okay, let's invest over a 10-year period and see if there's a return? I would encourage every think tank in London to look at this issue, because it is undeniably contributing to why it is so difficult to bring forward anything that is anywhere approaching reforming. I have a phrase that I use too often in my private office about polishing turds. It does feel a bit like that in government sometimes, that you're constant, and it's no one person's fault. I think it is a manifestation of a government structure that has grown over many, many, many years, and processes with good intention that are in place. But fundamentally, we've got to get to a stage where our government is able to, government itself, not this government, it's just government itself, can respond to the obvious, deal with the obvious, bring forward the reform packages that are obvious to anybody who knows their stuff, so that we can get on with helping people, and in this case, this particular area, the most vulnerable people in society. I hate to tell you, but my feeling is the statistics that were just read out are probably underestimates. If there's one thing that doctors are taught to do is observe. I've probably consulted about 75,000 patients approximately in my GP career, and you're now going to be very nervous because I'm going to be staring at you. There's a lot that you can actually observe in someone's behaviour, their look, their affect, which is a sort of psychiatric term in terms of their sort of appearance. And I haven't actually met a female prisoner or an ex-offender in a women's centre or anything who hasn't got a mental illness issue. The majority of them in prison have evidence of self-harm, I've noticed. You can just tell that empty look that you encounter so often when you deal with these people. I know there are plenty of people who agree who do this on a regular basis. We have to, as a society, recognise that although bad things are done, and I have met some bad apples, and I'd be quite happy for them to stay where they are, to be honest with you, but they are few and far between. The majority, clearly to my mind, the majority of women in prison shouldn't really be locked up. They need to be understood. They need a holistic approach. You need to look at them at the start and think, well, why are they here? What is it about their lives that's led to them making decisions that most of us, if not all of us in this room, would never have made? Probably because most of us have lived remarkably privileged lives to date. Now, I've got a speech to give that's been written for me, so allow me to give that, and then I shall be happy to answer your questions at the end. Firstly, can I thank the team at Centre for Social Justice for this insightful report. It not only raises a number of pertinent points about the challenges which female offenders and the services responding to them face, but also outlines practical and creative proposals we can take to tackle them. Secondly, I would like to emphasise an important theme that runs throughout this report: the need for a multi-agency, gender-responsive approach to female offenders that brings together local and national partners in a coordinated and accountable manner. Female offenders are some of our most vulnerable members of society and often have complex needs. As articulated in the report, a significant number of these women have histories of mental health issues, substance misuse, trauma and abuse, homelessness, poor education and unemployment. For many, these issues have developed prior to their involvement with the criminal justice system. Many of these women are also likely to be already engaged with different public services before they even commit a crime. Despite this, we know that outcomes for a significant number of women remain persistently and unacceptably poor. We must address these issues at the outset if we want to reduce crime, reduce reoffending, protect victims and the public. Achieving this requires a joined-up approach from the relevant government departments, national and local statutory services, and the voluntary sector to develop a coordinated multi-agency response. I'm pleased to say we are making some real progress in achieving this. And this is a principle that also underlies my female offender strategy. As set out in the report, we're investing £1 million seed funding to support local areas to develop new ways of working with female offenders by adopting a multi-agency, often termed whole system, approach. The whole system model brings together local agencies, criminal justice, statutory and voluntary. Together they provide the holistic, targeted support a female offender needs with a shared investment and outcomes. The National Probation Service and community rehabilitation companies are key partners, ensuring that female offenders receive targeted wraparound support both through the gate and in the community. Women's centres are often at the heart of many of these whole system approach models, but I have been impressed by the women's centres that I have visited. Over the past year, I met staff and service users at Nelson Trust and Anawin, which are both providing valuable support to vulnerable women. I recognise the hugely important role that these women's centres can play in supporting female offenders and those at risk of offending. Our best response to female offending must be one that is locally led. Another recent success commended in the report is that of liaison and diversion services. L&D services place clinical staff at police stations and courts to provide assessments and referrals at an earlier stage. In doing so, we can intervene early to support people with mental health, drug and alcohol issues as soon as they come to the attention of the criminal justice system. L&D services will be operating across 82% of England by the end of March 2018 and across 90% of the country by the end of March 2019. Full rollout is expected by 2020 to 2021. And we are going further. NHS England are currently enhancing women's pathways across all L&D services to address the specific needs of women in the criminal justice system. A specific women's lead will be appointed in each service to focus on this. Services will offer to see all females who come into custody, provide females with a choice of the gender of their practitioner, offer gender-sensitive tools for screening, and provide effective onward referrals to gender-specific and sensitive services. The needs of particular groups, such as women's sex workers and foreign national women, will also be considered. These pathways will be co-designed with women with lived experience. This will mean that more female offenders will be diverted away from the criminal justice system in the first place, away from charge or to a community sentence. I firmly believe that early intervention is an important part of our response to female offending. Not only does it improve outcomes for these women, but also their children, their families, and the public as a whole. As the report outlines, police and crime commissioners have a real appetite to be more involved in a new approach for female offenders. This is extremely welcome. PCCs play a valuable role as visible and accountable leaders of the local police and crime systems. And combined authorities bring together several services which are crucial to reduce reoffending. I recognise the potential benefits that a more locally led system offers. I am keen to work closely with PCCs and combined authorities to explore this further. It is crucial that we work more closely with these local partners to tackle the issues leading women into the criminal justice system. To deliver this, we have signed devolution agreements with several areas, including Greater Manchester, Liverpool City region, West Midlands and Greater London. The Ministry of Justice is committed to exploring options to provide greater devolution of criminal justice responsibility and budgets to local commissioners. Another issue raised in the report was that of awareness of pre-sentence report writers of the disposals available in their areas. We have recently undertaken an audit of pre-sentence reports and assessment tools for female offenders at court. This looked at how we could take a more gender-responsive and trauma-informed approach towards the women we are working with. Cross-departmental work is now progressing to increase the quality of assessments for female offenders, and a work plan has been developed to take this work forward. This work is also looking to increase the take-up of effective community sentences in line with sentencing guidelines. This work is being carried out in partnership with the National Probation Service and the community rehabilitation companies. However, for these changes to have the necessary impact, it is essential that we have a gender-informed workforce. We continue to roll out trauma-informed training to criminal justice professionals. Training is now being extended across the National Probation Service and CRCs, as well as to prison staff. We have also supported the wider criminal justice system rollout of the Safeguarding Children when Sentencing Mothers training material, completed by Dr. Shona Minson. This training raises awareness of the diverse implications of maternal imprisonment for children. I would like to reiterate my thanks to Dr. Minson for her invaluable work. Today's report also rightly highlights the challenges which prisoners face when leaving prison, particularly around access to welfare support. Prisoners are able to speak to a Department of Work and Pensions work coach before release. They can make an appointment at the relevant job centre as early as the day of release. Once the former prisoner attends the job centre to complete their claim, eligible prisoners can receive funds within hours. However, we recognise that more can be done. That is why we are working with the Department of Work and Pensions to improve the process with the aim of enabling a claim in advance of release. And I want to do more to help women into employment on release too. Getting and keeping a job can change people's lives, and work is the best route out of crime. The Prison and Probation Service have an important role to help offenders build the skills and experience they need whilst they're in prison, so they can have the right attitude for work and get a job when they're released. As the Secretary of State outlined on March the 6th, we will shortly be launching our education and employment strategy. This will set out our approach to helping offenders get the skills they need to find a job and avoid the activities that landed them in prison in the first place. Another factor that plays an important part in rehabilitation is accommodation. There is considerable evidence which tells us there is a link between lack of stable accommodation and reoffending. Suitable accommodation plays an important part in enabling offenders to get a job, into training, or registered with a GP. HMPPS has undertaken some initiatives to improve access to accommodation, such as expanding the BAS contract to offer accommodation to offenders on licence. We continue to work with all probation providers to help make sure offenders get the support they need to find accommodation on release. But accommodation is a serious problem which requires a cross-departmental response, as recognised in the report's recommendations. We are working with the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government to improve access to housing for those being released from prison. As part of this, we are investigating how Housing First and proposals regarding the private rented sector could help to ensure that offenders with complex needs, including female offenders, can secure suitable accommodation. This work will form part of the wider government commitment to eliminate homelessness. As you know, my female offender strategy is due shortly. I hope to outline in this what further progress we have made in the areas I have highlighted today and others to address the challenges which female offenders face. This is a complex issue and one that I want to get right. Thank you for having me here today to support the launch of this report. I look forward to your questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. So we'll hear from the others first, and then we'll have some questions. Just picking up on that, there, the CSJ has long talked about work being the best route out of poverty, and actually in January this year, Rory, our head of criminal justice, challenged me and said, "Can we make this the year where the CSJ says actually work is the best route out of crime as well?" So to hear that was really encouraging as well. But over to Rory. Rory's not just the guy that sits next to me at work, he's also our head of criminal justice and a former copper, and the person that put together this report now sitting in front of you. So, yeah.
It was a long night last night, a brilliant night as well, but I have rarely actually made some notes, so forgive me if at times I look at my notes rather than at you guys. Thank you, Ed, thank you, Phillip, thank you for all attending today. The issue of vulnerable female offenders, it's one it's hard not to be moved by. As a police officer down in South London, in Lambeth, I've regularly come into contact with women, often mothers, as we know, addicted to drugs, victims of physical and sexual violence, suffering mental health issues, and worse, and often caught up in the revolving door of crime. As we know, much of the crime they commit is to fund their addiction or the addiction of others. And amid that misery and the stresses and strains of that life, they often find themselves swept up into other offending. They find themselves committing antisocial behaviour, finding themselves getting evicted from housing, and so on and so forth, even assaulting me at times, which I can't understand why anyone would want to assault me. And eventually many of them find themselves in prison, and repeatedly so. And as I found, the criminal justice process would often do little to tackle those underlying causes, so I'd get to know the women on their first name terms, with a depressing sort of regularity. And so it was a real pleasure to be able to join the CSJ, set up the criminal justice unit, and be able to look at this area. Hearing some of the personal stories of the women out on the street, kind of witnessing some of the most painful aspects of their lives, it was truly harrowing, and I don't need to repeat that to you guys today. So that's one of the reasons we're looking at this area, shining a light on it, seeking to make practical proposals, and thank you for you all who've kind of fed into this work. As chapter 1 of the report sets out, as it's obvious, the overwhelming majority of these women who end up in our criminal justice system and in our prisons are born of social breakdown and state failure. They're not the sole authors of their destiny, but there's so much we can do to help them chart a more positive course. The very issues on which the CSJ is founded, of course, are social breakdown and state failure, and how those two things can keep people in poverty or drag people into poverty. So since last summer we've spent time across the country. I know Phillip as well has spent time across the country, and his team too, at places like Anawim in Birmingham, the Nelson Trust, and we're delighted that Rose is able to join us today from the Nelson Trust in Gloucester, Brighton's Women's Centre, the Women's Sports Centre in Woking, and many others. And they all work so tirelessly in support of vulnerable women and vulnerable female offenders. Along the way we've met some truly incredible people. Many of them are here today, others send their apologies. And speaking bluntly, the issue of vulnerable female offenders is one that has been fudged, Philip might want to cover his ears, fudged for decades by successive governments. And I certainly was heartened, actually, that Philip was retained in the Ministry of Justice with the brief around female offenders. I don't envy him the task. It's a huge brief to cover, and there is so much to do, and it is, as he's already said, so important to get the right approach in what is a complex area. So I'm delighted to launch our report today, which hopefully you've all got a copy of, a woman-centred approach, freeing vulnerable women from the revolving door of crime. Our proposals seek to build on the many publications, and Baroness Corson and others have cited just how many reports and strategies and publications have been in the past, and we seek to set out how this government and future governments could commit to that new approach that builds on what we know what works and what would enhance rather than undermine public safety, and signal a real commitment to things we all care about: social justice, social mobility, and tackling that intergenerational poverty and crime. One key difference between the political environment today and when Baroness Corson authored her review is the creation of Police and Crime Commission, and I'm delighted that we have a few PCCs in the room, one on the panel too. The foreword to the report, of course, also authored by a Police and Crime Commissioner. They've shown themselves in our exclusive survey, which is in the report, to have huge appetite for this area. We've got a 66% response rate in this area, so it's a fairly representative sample. To give you some of those headline stats, so 81% recognised clear evidence in favour of trauma-informed and gender-specific or gender-responsive programmes in criminal justice. 89% believe they have a pivotal role in transforming approaches to female offenders and reducing recidivism. 74% believe that the government's forthcoming female offender strategy should allow PCCs to take greater ownership of the female offender cohort. Same proportion say they think they can commission better services than the centre. And 93% believe they could help leverage other funding sources, and many already do, and help convene partners to help improve the outcomes for female offender cohorts. The remarks of David Lloyd in the foreword, as you'll have seen, signals that desire also. And we share the ambition for this sort of positive change. And in our engagement with the Minister at our event in October up in Manchester, and again today, it's clear that we are not alone. And it's a pleasure to have you all here sharing in that also. It would also be remiss not to mention one other key point. Many of the women in prison or on community sentences or otherwise at risk of offending are mothers. That means they have children. And those children, as we've seen from the various stats, which I think Philip's quite right to say are kind of, if anything, an underestimate, these children are themselves at huge risk of lives of poverty and crime themselves. The adverse childhood experiences that we set out in Chapter 1, they're all too common for those born into circumstances of social breakdown, family breakdown, and indeed state failure. So while we talk today about vulnerable female offenders, we're also talking about their children, actually. We're talking about their future children and the cycles of intergenerational poverty and crime that the CSJ has now for 14 years been and remains committed to tackling. In our report, we set out 10 recommendations. The exact sum, unlike a lot of think tank reports, is actually only 2 pages, literally 2 sides of A4, so there's really no excuse not to have a look through it. I will, just to make sure everyone leaves the room with a clear sense of them, just quickly run through them. So the first one really is to create a transformation fund for women in relation to criminal justice, recognising the need to develop a funding pool against which PCCs can seek capital and revenue funding to provide and support the creation and provision of high-quality, community-based services. Government should also suspend the plans for the community prisons for women and allocate the funding there up to £50 million towards that fund, supporting that development of capacity and infrastructure. We also want to redirect a sum equivalent to the core allowance of the universal credit into the transformation fund for women, equivalent for each prison space, totalling around £15 million of additional annual funding. This should be used to support that high quality community-based programmes. We know already that many women's centres operate on a literal shoestring, so even these sorts of sums, which to many may seem paltry, are indeed huge. There's a real opportunity here to support that high quality programmes that are already underway and to develop them further. Government should also commit to ensure that the women's prison population declines and cost savings are realised. And essentially, half of those funds we would suggest should be put into a sort of justice reinvestment strand to that transformation fund. Government should encourage, and for many it's pushing on an open door, I might add, encourage PCCs and the philanthropic sector to leverage other funds at a local level. Alongside that, of course, we suggest an implementation of evaluation and ideally a feasibility study to see to what extent we might be able to move towards an outcome-based model. PCCs working with local women's centres and other partners, many of them already doing this, should develop a package of accommodation, monitoring, supervision and rehabilitation measures that can be attached to community and suspended sentence orders, providing those sentences with credible and evidence alternative options, helping prevent that unnecessary imprisonment that we do see. And this same or similar packages could of course then also be offered on a voluntary basis to women at risk. As we've already sort of heard, the National Probation Service should be placed under that real positive obligation to understand what's available locally for women and actually have to set out reasons why referral to such services would or would not be appropriate. The government should also build on our proposals that we put out last year, and John Samuels is in the room here, one of the authors of that report. We should actually build on those proposals of piloting some problem solving at courts, making use of judicial monitoring to focus and drive improved outcomes in relation to drug addicted female offenders in particular. Government should also welcome applications from PCCs to pilot services for female offenders. And it was a real pleasure actually when I was sort of sending over to Ed earlier the dreadful list of the extent of Philip's brief to see actually devolution with PCCs actually singled out as a specific area. Finally, as we're getting through the list now, government should also ensure that every woman with an identified financial need should leave prison with access to a minimum of the core allowance of universal credit. You know, kicking women out of prison with 46 quid and a leaflet, we can do better. And that would help reduce crime and, with some positive expectations, help reinforce that pro-social re-entry into the community. Finally, if the above measures might help keep women out of prison and help prevent them returning, by focusing resources on earlier and more effective intervention, what might help those women who do find themselves in prison? And this is where we encourage government to review release on temporary licence arrangements and to potentially create a new earned release and community payback form of ROTL. Something that back in the day, back in 2007, 8, 9, public polling was conducted, and you'll see the figures in the report. I think 80+% of the public actually supported a measure in which non-violent female offenders would go to local women's centres and, in addition to tackling those underlying needs, make good on society through community payback or similar. And that would harness the power of incentives to help foster desistance and encourage the positive change that I know we all want to see. It's a change that would not require primary legislation, and it provides a valuable means of both releasing prison space within the female estate, allowing officers obviously to spend more time with those most vulnerable, most challenging individuals, and enabling women to enter more sustainable employment, training or otherwise address their basic needs. And we'd see such women earning release into the support of an appropriate local service, such as local women's centres, who already do so much to support female offenders. Finally, and I do promise this is finally, as the final chapter of our report highlights, creating the opportunities to free vulnerable female offenders from the revolving door of crime is a question of political will. Nick Hardwick said it, Baroness Causton said it, CSJ saying it. This is a real issue that can be tackled. So just as it was over a decade ago in 2007 with Baroness Causton's report on vulnerable female offenders, it's our hope that a government committed to social reform will take the opportunity to harness women's centres, other services and the flagship policies of both police and crime commissioners and universal credit to drive the sort of improvement in outcomes that I know we are all so keen to see. That's enough from me for now. Thank you very much.
Yes, as Rory mentioned, there is a brilliant survey of PCCs in here, and I think these are a new sort of piece of the jigsaw of the landscape that we've got to work with. And so it's fantastic to have a PCC here down from North Yorkshire. So Julia, welcome.
Thank you very much. This is a sort of deja vu moment where we all met at a fringe event at Conservative Party conference back in Manchester. So I very much welcome the invitation, Rory, and you've been up to see me in North Yorkshire, so thank you very much. I also really welcome the CSJ's wider remit around criminal justice. I think there's been a gap in the market, if you like, amongst think tanks for this area over the past few years, so it's really good to see the CSJ really making their presence felt, so thank you very much. I wanted to start with a story, really, because I really got interested in this area right from the sort of get-go, but it was really brought home to me when a friend of a friend told me about what had happened to a member of her family. She'd been convicted of a fraud and had ended up in Style. And it was a fraud against a public sector organisation, and when she got to court, the probation services said to her, "We really think that given your circumstances, you won't get a custodial sentence." She got into the courtroom and the judge said, "I'm going to make an example of you. You've stolen public money, you're getting a custodial sentence." What wasn't told was the fact that she previously had a stillbirth baby and that she was suffering from postnatal depression at the time of her offence, and none of this was taken into account. When she got to Style, she was not able to access her medication for her mental health requirements, and that led to all sorts of consequences, as you can imagine. And so when you hear stories like that, and you read the report that Rory has put in here about trauma-informed approach and unmet needs and all of the rest of it, we really, really need to start to deliver a better approach for these very vulnerable women in our society. So I'm going to lay down the gauntlet a little bit. I know Phillip has got a very long list of things to do, but this, I think, is something we can solve. If we all collectively get together and make our voices heard and devolve things down to local levels, we can make a difference in our local communities. So you know, the government has said it's a reforming government. This is an opportunity to grasp that nettle and make those reforms, because you've got a whole great plethora of people with a real desire to make this work and to make a difference. So I challenge you, Phillip. I know you are one of the longest serving ministers in the MOJ now. So that clearly says a lot. Let's crack on. And I just, in North Yorkshire, it's really interesting. We have, last year, 1,526 women were arrested, of which 608 were charged. We actually have no idea, because the data is so difficult to get hold of, how many people we actually have in prison in our area. And of course the prison estate is incredibly fragmented, so we do happen to have a female prison in North Yorkshire, but it caters for many people across the country, and of course the Style over the border in Cheshire. And actually prison is not the answer. You can see from the statistics in the report that it is failing. And we've got other alternative approaches that we can do. And I'll just give you a really good example. And it goes to your point about how PCCs can leverage other things going on in our local area. So I chair, as I know Katie does in the audience here, my local criminal justice board. And I also co-chair the Mental Health Crisis Care Concordat. So those two together put PCCs in my area and others in a sort of pivotal position to really have a look at a system-wide approach in our local areas. So I fund something called the York Pathways Programme. It's funded originally by Together Mental Health, so it fits in with the idea of bringing philanthropic help into this. Where we really help the very most vulnerable people in the city of York, and we've had some phenomenal success with it. So a 45% reduction in offending, an 81% reduction in the number of calls to Yorkshire Ambulance Service, and a 48% reduction in emergency admissions. So the types of things that we can do don't only help female offenders and offending behaviour, but actually really helps address those unmet needs that the women who are committing these offences have. And PCCs are ideally placed to try and bring all of these things together in our local area. And I know we're sort of new on the block, if you like, or relatively new, although some of it are a bit grey now, a little bit. 5 years in the job. And a lot of the focus has been around our interaction with the police service, but it is time really for PCCs to grasp the nettle around criminal justice and really start to make a difference in our local areas. So Philip, if you're serious about devolution to us, we are. You can see from the results of the survey. We bring it on, please, and let us get on and make a difference. So thank you very much.
Fourthly, so the CSJ is nothing if we do not learn from what is going on Frontline. And we've mentioned a couple of times our awards last night, which were looking exactly that, and it's fantastic to have Rose from the Nelson Trust, who are a winner of one of our previous awards, who do fantastic work with ex-offenders, people with addiction, and all kinds. And so, Rose, it's a real pleasure to have you here. Come share with us.
First of all, I want to thank Rory and the Centre for Social Justice for the report and the call for it for funding for women's centres. And I'd also like to thank the Minister for your speech. And I don't know why I brought my notebook up, because I thought I was going to do my usual funding for the women's centres, and I was listening to Dr. Phillip Lee, and I was listening to Rory, and Rory had sent me the executive summary of the report, and I hadn't had the whole report, I'd just seen it, and I'm standing here and I'm feeling rather hopeful. I feel a bit wobbly actually. I've been in women's services for the last 17 years. I've had my own experience of going through the criminal justice system when the Colston report came out and the funding was available for the women's centres. Felt really hopeful, and it felt like there was a real movement at the time. And then things started to go awry. And I was saying to Dr. Kate Paradine earlier before this meeting, I said, it's like we're in a parallel process with the women that we work with. Yeah, we're in survival mode. The women we work with are often in survival mode, facing really difficult, financially challenged situations, resource hungry, and so the women's centres. And yet we continue to do a good job working with some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And I nearly fell off my chair this morning and I so welcome it, the idea of trauma-informed approaches. I feel like we finally arrived with that. So I'm really pleased to hear that. And maybe it will facilitate a new thinking around how we punish some of the most traumatised women in our society under the guise of public protection, helping them. We've got to remember, one of the statistics that I came down with, I'm not going to go through them all because I feel slightly disarmed, is 83% of women are in prison for a non-violent offence. 70% of women are in prison for 6 months or less. Hugely damaging to their lives. They're likely to lose their accommodation, lose any prospects they may have had, any courses they might be involved in. They're likely to have lost their children. And we talk about tackling the intergenerational. We have to support the women, otherwise the children of those women will have similar experiences to them, and we have to stop that. There's 17,000 children of the mothers currently in prison. We can't allow those children to have the same experiences as their mothers. So I feel really hopeful, and I just want to take it down locally. In the areas in which we operate in, we're lucky enough to get some support from our local PCCs, particularly in Gloucestershire at the moment, where the local PCC is funding for initiatives, mainly prevention work, which we really welcome. So I really welcome the findings of this report. I would still call, don't spend £50 million on opening new women's prisons in the community. That money would be best served where the women are best served, in the community. And I would also call for, again, for any funding that's attached to the female offender report, if the recommendations are taken up from this report, that there's money ring-fenced for the women's centres who have proven time and time again, through report after report after report, of their efficacy and the results and the outcomes they bring for the women that they work with in their local communities, that funding is truly local and not available, if you like, for large companies who come into local areas and scoop up local funding away from the people who know the women best in their own communities. So I would ask you to be mindful of that, please. And I really welcome the report. I do believe from our own experience that the PCCs have a pivotal role in the local areas in tackling female offending. And I want to go back to where we started this morning, just before I finish, is I forgot what I was going to say. It was really important at that moment. Dr. Phillip Lee, you said about the empty look in the eyes of the female offenders, and I think that's really poignant. And if you go on the wings in any women's prison in this country, we'll all see that, But what we have to do is, that's what I just remember what I was going to say. If we're dealing with a cohort of 4,000 and it feels a standard Tranmere Rovers, I mean, come on, we've got to be able to do this together, and I think doing it together is the most important thing. So I really welcome the report, I really welcome your intentions as well, Minister, and together we can do it. And to coin an old women's phrase, together we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. I want to open it up to the floor for a bit of time now, so be thinking of your questions. And if you have a question, raise your hand, say who you are, etc. I'm going to abuse my position, though, as chair, to ask the first question, if I may. And Rose, you were very honest there and said you had come through this system yourself. We hear a lot of sort of statistics and talk about systems and things, but in your experience, what made the difference for you?
I'll be right. The difference for me when I came out of prison back into same old, bearing in mind, I'm knocking on a bit, it was quite a few years ago, was someone in community-based services who believed in me and wanted to help me in my recovery, and it really is as simple as that. And that's how I was set on my trajectory into healing, recovery and empowerment, which are the fundamental approaches of any trauma-informed service. So that was really important to somebody recognised, maybe by my haunted look, and asked me, what has happened to you? Yeah, not what have you done, what are you doing, what is wrong with you, what happened to you, and helped me address it.
Thank you. Right, over to you. Yes, you say who you are, where you're from.
Phil Bowen, Centre for Justice Innovation. Firstly, welcome the report. I think it's a fantastic report. I'm a recovering civil servant, so I empathise with the Minister about civil service inertia. I welcome the commitment to liaison diversion, getting women out of court and out of the system as much as we can. But the fact is that there will be women who still arrive in court, and there will be sentencers who don't feel they have options. So I particularly welcome the recommendation around the trial in problem-solving courts. And so I guess my question is, I just hope that in the forthcoming female offender strategy, it recognises the role of problem-solving courts. We already have a women-centred one in Manchester. To talk about government, not lethargy, but the power of government, the Scottish Government, 2 years after the Angelini Commission, set up a women's problem-solving court in Aberdeen. So I really hope that, and I'm also sitting next to one of the other people on the problem-solving court working group set up by Justice Secretary 3 or 4 times ago. I can never quite remember now.
Last week.
Was it last week? Yes. So I just commend the report I commend in particular the recommendation about problem-solving courts, and I look forward to the Minister being able to at least explore those options for women who are coming to court who just need a better and credible option, because I think there are sentences who feel like there is no option, and I think problem-solving is a really good option.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, in addition to the long list read out earlier, I used to also have family justice. It was taken off me by my first Secretary of State. In the time, it was thought that I maybe had too much to cover, which I thought was very generous of them. But it was a bit frustrating because actually the family justice, there was a lot of crossover because of most of the women in the prison system, there are family dysfunctionality issues. The myriad of them, and you just see more. So I looked at the problem-solving thing when I had that in the first sort of 3 months of being in the job, and so yes, I'm persuaded of their merits. It's no longer with me; it's now with Minister Fraser. So it's her brief. So I can't promise anything in the strategy on this area, but I personally think that if we can adopt a holistic approach from start to finish, so pre-court, in court, arrival at prison, leaving prison, at all stages you are considering the issues of that individual, which is why actually the localisation of responsibility also makes intellectual sense. The best general practice is where you have a relatively small number of people in the hands of one GP, and they can make a decision because they know that where they live, they know their relatives, they know their lovers and ex-lovers, they know the whole dynamics around the house, the home. And it's those dynamics that drive often the behaviour that ends up, in some cases, people ending up in prison. You can't do that in an ivory tower just over here. There are 4,000 locked up at any one time, but there are thousands more who are sort of in the community. In order to have that touch, that feel, that understanding, I think you've got to get the numbers down to a smaller number and put someone locally accountable for that, or a team, a sort of a board that meets to discuss where a woman should be in the criminal justice system. And sometimes the answer will be prison. But in other times it will be, well, okay, what can we do here? Tagging, can we get them with the women's centre? And when they leave the prison, when they're not going back to that flat, because we know that that's where the problems start. Those sorts of decisions. So the strategy won't be able to give it in its entirety what I would like to achieve, but I think it can certainly show a sort of path, direction of travel to what I think you're alluding to.
Who else might say on it?
No, just to say, just to echo, I suppose, Phil's point. Problem-solving courts, we know they can work, and it's great to have those examples highlighted. And certainly, if you want to read more, there's obviously our previous paper on what happened to the Rehabilitation Revolution, published by Jonathan Aitken and His Honour John Samuels, QC. That's available on our website too. End of plug.
Julia.
Well, we have a really good youth outcomes panel actually, which is doing some really good work with young people. I think one of the challenges for people locally is actually making sure that all the people who are sort of part of that local system understand what you're trying to achieve. So our female diversion service hasn't been very successful, and we're trying to understand why that is. And we think it's because a lot of the police officers don't actually understand. Well, why should we treat women differently? And so there's a lot of real practical work that we need to do through our local criminal justice boards, because the structures are there to do it. To actually get all of the different cogs in the system working together well, because just putting a single intervention into a locality isn't going to work. The whole system has to join up.
And I suppose just to add on Julia's point, as a former police officer, I feel the need to sort of, I suppose, talk a little bit about that cultural issue where it does exist. And if you think, my experience in policing was very much, it was twofold really, gangs, but also basically a real core of proactive community policing. Well, community policing, like general practice, you get to know families, you get to know women, you get to know communities, you get to know the kids, and you can see how it all is connected. Of course, other cops, on response team, they only ever turn up when they've been called because there's some carry-on. So they turn up, it's all kicking off, people are being abusive and stuff. So over time, you can see how that sort of almost compassion fatigue kind of sets in. Again, a kind of trauma-informed kind of aspect to that. So I would say, sort of even more broadly, kind of the role of community policing in some of this is key.
Yes.
I'm Kate Paradine, Women in Prison, and we run 3 women's centres in Woking, Manchester and Lambeth, so we know really well the survival mode that we're all in and the desperate situation that the vast majority of women's centres face, which is staff permanently at risk of redundancy. One pot ends, you might get a little bit more, but then another pot is due to end, so it really is quite desperate at the moment. And I won't ask about the £3 billion that was found extra for CRCs or the 50 million that's been set aside or was set aside for new women's prisons. But what I wanted to ask the Minister about was the money set aside for payment by results for the CRCs, which we know now in the vast majority of cases won't be getting that money. And many of us have been wondering if that money could be reused for where it's really needed and perhaps to make good some of the damage that has been done by the transforming rehabilitation reforms to the services on the ground, like those that Rose has spoken about and those that we run. I appreciate this is one you might not be able to answer on the spot, Minister.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Kate. And I'm very much looking forward to coming down to Woking at the end of this month, because at the centre, look, it's not with me, probation, it's with Mrs. Stewart. And yes, I sense your frustration and I share your analysis in many ways. Okay, the probation service, the original reforms, I think one of the difficulties we've uncovered during the development of this strategy is women have been very marginalised in this. The services for the women in the community haven't been being delivered in the way that would have been hoped when the original contracts were signed. Part of that is to do with the fact that there are fewer women, and so the CRCs are concentrating the great majority of their resources upon men. I have sympathy with the idea of fishing around for funding. I'm doing it myself at the moment. I've contacted the Minister responsible for the Tampon Tax Fund. I'm working as hard as I can within government to find funding for the strategy. So there's a certain irony that I'm doing that on my side and you're doing it on your side. And I think that's something which everyone should reflect upon in government, I think, because it indicates a lack of priority.
Yeah.
And I, as you can probably tell, I'm quite frustrated. Okay. And I'm trying to sort of hold the line, but I am frustrated because, like Rory quite rightly said, we can see what we need to do, and the return would be immense. If I look at, say, the cost of prison places, I mean, some of them are above 60,000 a year per place. It doesn't make sense to be paying out over £60,000 per place per year when we know these women are not, shouldn't be in prison. Not one because of their past history, but also because we know it's not working for them. So the frustration is how do you break that cycle? But I sort of alluded to it in my opening remarks around depends over what period of time you cost sort of investment and return. And I think that's something which I'm pushing back upon a bit at the moment, saying, well, it's all right, I can balance books, that's the easy bit. It's whether you can balance books and deliver the outcomes. Yeah. It's a separate thing. I can't give a detailed answer on that, you know I can't, but I continue to battle away because I don't think the service is there in probation for women that should be there. And hopefully we can, there are things in the pipeline around those contracts which I can't talk about, which hopefully we can make them somewhat better. But it's always going to be difficult because we're dealing with a relatively small percentage of offenders being women. That's the problem.
Can I just put that in just context? So the cost of a prison place, I think, in the report is around £60,000,
it goes from about 38 to 65, off the top of my head, something like that.
So our Women's Diversion Scheme, the cost of supporting a woman in that was £857.
Yeah.
So that just, it's frustrating.
Yeah.
Try being me.
I think
I mean, similarly around the figures locally, we get paid £770 per head per woman for support in the community. That's what we get paid to keep her out. Probably costs us £4,000 per annum for an intensive support intervention that's ongoing. So we have to make up the rest of the money. whereas we've heard the prison place figures. So it is deeply frustrating, and it just doesn't make any sense because we're getting paid a very small amount to keep the women out, and they're getting paid, they're paid a vast amount of money to keep them in. The numbers don't add up.
Thank you.
Yes.
My name is Nick Campsey. I'm chairman of the Madison Foundation and also on the advisory board of the criminal justice leg of the CSJ. My question is for the Minister, if I may. Your observation on the myopia in terms of how government thinks about financing and investment and return is exceptionally well observed, and everyone was nodding. It's sort of like colonising Mars in terms of solving that. What are the observations that you have in terms of what people like you can do, people like the CSJ can do, people like everyone in this room can do? What levers should we be pulling over the next decade so that when we all convene in 10 years' time, we're not just making that same observation, which seems endemic? So what can we actually do, and what should we be lobbying for to try to have a more long-term commercial perspective on allocating capital?
Okay, I mean, it isn't one person's fault. I mean, I think this is. I mean, we could have a broader discussion about the difficulty of governing in an age of 24-hour news media and Twitter and the like, and constantly having to be seen to say things and to respond and to act, when we all know in our own lives that to make decisions and to take time to think things through, and yet government apparently it's more about communication than thinking. And I sort of understand why that's the case. So there's a broader issue about how democratic government functions in Western. If you look at Western democracy at the moment, it is rather in crisis, I think. So how do you govern in that space? And so it's extremely difficult for everybody in government. So there's not a personal criticism in my comments. It's just when you look at something like this, it took me. First thing I read was the Courser report. So I went away on my holidays. Took about a box of about 700 pages, and I read through it. The first thing I read was the Courser report. So in September 2016, I knew what I wanted to do. I'd concluded what the problems were. If I say this to my wife all the time, if I made decisions at the pace I do as a minister in general practice, I wouldn't exist. Being a full-time GP, I'd probably make about 100 decisions a day. Some of them life-changing. I haven't made 100 decisions since I've been a minister. And so for me, it's been quite an interesting. So I went through it, classic sort of doctor training, history taking, examination, decision making. Yeah, this is what I've been drilled to do. So in September 2016, I had an idea of, right, okay, made some of the finer details, but generally speaking, I knew what I was doing. Here we are, March 2018. And we're still pushing. I'm still pushing. I think we can deliver something significant. I think there's support within government, both within the department and higher up for this. But yet it's still not there. And I think that that's something which it troubles me, because this is just one area. I mean, we're talking, say we take the £50 million figure, yeah? This is an accounting error. Even within the department, it's an accounting error size. It's not a significant sum of money. How can this be? Because it troubles me that if we can't do it in this very, very small area when the facts are so obvious, what does that say about £750 billion of annual expenditure in government? And all of my colleagues across ministerial ranks are all, I'm sure, confronting this challenge of sort of in each individual areas, thinking, well, actually that's what we've got to do, and coming up against this machine that nobody seems to want to get a hold of. And you end up with a sense of learned helplessness in the system, which is a psychiatric symptom, yeah? And you used to see this in hospitals. So staff walking around going, well, it's just the way it is. It's just the way it is, I know it's silly, I know you have to wait, it's just the way it is. It's a sense of, and I observe this in government. And yet there's some really good people, really good civil servants, really good ministers, all trying, and yet somehow it's just not. And I think, it's been a real education for me, actually, about how things are. But look, going back to this issue, I think we can deliver something in the next couple of months. That's the sort of timetable I'm working on. I would have hoped to have done it quicker than I have done. I'm slightly embarrassed to be in front of quite a few people whose faces I recognise, saying the same things I was saying a year ago. But I'm having to get used to the fact that I had a profession where I made a decision and it happened. And it's not like that, politics.
So how can we help?
I think actually is to do with it's a broader thing. It's outside of this issue. Actually, it's to try to get to a point where government isn't risk averse. I'll give you an example. Sorry to ramble. I went to, and everybody in the room who's got any interest in youth justice should go to Diagrama in Spain. And I turned up at the institution. I did a day trip to Spain. Believe it, the silliness of my life. I flew to Malaga and back in the day to go to a unit in Cordoba. Diagrama is a not-for-profit organisation that runs about 70% of the youth justice space, custody space in Spain. And I turned up because I wanted to see this institution and compare it to the other youth justice institutions I'm responsible for, some of which are deeply stressed and by any measure failing. Yeah? The contrast between the two was stark. They were taking exactly the same sorts of people that committed murder, rape, serious crimes, and yet security staff, minimal. The security within the building, minimal. The type of the classrooms, it was a woman treating 12 potentially violent young men, no security staff. I went to an institution last week. There were 5 boys, 1 teacher, and 2 security staff in a classroom in this country. The contrast was stark. The recidivism rate, my God, we could do with this here. Why aren't we doing it? There's a risk aversity. There's a risk aversity to do anything that isn't like we've done before. The briefs I get as a minister have risk implications sections. It's really quite striking. And you think, how do you break out of that cycle? In a 24-hour news media age, journalists in the room, tweeting away, how do you break out of it and actually be prepared to do something different, prepared to do something that might actually not work? Yeah, how about that for a radical idea? Trying to do that, that's what it's about here. So it applies today to this area, but actually it's across all of criminal justice that we sort of want to do something, but we stop because of the potential risk of it. And I think that's fundamentally where the problem lies. And I'm trying to do my bit by speaking like this. Yeah, but it actually requires the public and people, particularly people who are engaged in policy, like you all are, to actually get out there and keep saying, well, actually, we've got to try something different here and take a few risks.
So is that your answer to Julia? That's how we can help?
Yes.
But I think, so in women's centres, the police, as a GP, you assess those risks, don't you, on a daily basis, and you make decisions. And for me, if government can be brave enough to devolve the risk down to a local level, let the professionals, as you were as a GP, take those risks. Yes. And we do that. I get the police service come and go, oh, you can't do that, you can't do that. Well, yes, we can. And we sit round a table and we take those risks on a daily basis. And it's not your neck that's on the line then, it's our neck that's on the line, and our survival of the organisations that we're responsible for and running.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with devolving, but the point is, I'm quite happy to put my neck on the line. Because, I even was filmed on Channel 5 on GP Behind Closed Doors, working as a doctor, making decisions about patients. I was being filmed, and it was broadcast to 1 million people. And in my head, I'm going, do I refer this person or not? Has this person got cancer or not? Does this person need acute treatment or not? For me, it's like, it's not easy, and I've been properly trained and by brilliant people throughout my professional life. But fundamentally, I'm prepared to make decisions that might not work, because that's professionally what I do as a doctor. You're right, it would be better done lower down, because you understand your areas and all the systems in place, and health and justice have to work together. Okay, and we all get that, because mental illness is a key determinant of whether people end up in the system or not. But I just think that I'm quite happy just to sort of stand up and say something which might not work. because that's sort of what I'm used to.
Rose or Rory?
I mean, I think Philip's right. I think it extends far beyond just criminal justice, female offenders. It's something I'm sure my colleagues across the other units will be looking at as well. So if people do want to join us on that journey to help Philip and others take the risks and so on, please do get in touch.
Diagrammer told me it took them 5 years to get rid of fencing because they inherited the building, and the state had spent all this money on fencing and locked doors and walls and everything else, and they've been knocking them down. In fact, the boys have been taking them out. Boys have been painting the walls. And I remember walking into one area, and a guy turned around, one of the kids, and he'd done something quite serious. He had a welding gun in his hand. Now, I tell you what, if that happened to be at Felton or anywhere else, I'd be thinking, not so sure about this. But the culture in the place was, you have to do this to try to normalise their behaviour, try to get them to understand. And they were all traumatised, these individuals. They'd all done bad things, which they should serve time for in many cases. It's not like I'm some sort of woolly-headed liberal who thinks that we shouldn't have prisons. Of course we're going to need prisons in society, but at least let's make them environments in which people can recover and turn their lives around.
I think I would add a bit of a plug for Rory. So at the CSJ, I joined here 18 months ago, and I was very conscious that we had done some fantastic reports on criminal justice space, but we hadn't always managed to keep someone in the game pushing and driving and making these things hit home. And so we recruited Rory as the head of criminal justice. So part of his job is writing reports, but his other job is to be out there talking to you, and he wants you to harass him and say, what do I need to be doing in this space? So he is a permanent voice for this here, because we think that's enormously important. I've got time for one more question. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Daniela. I'm the parliamentary assistant to the Bishop to Her Majesty's Prison, James Langstaff, and Bishop Rachel, who just left at Trewick, who is doing the women's estate. Thank you for the report. We're very welcome. And I really had been thinking about that theme, about freeing vulnerable women from the revolving door of crime, since I had the invitation. And I had been looking at that. Yesterday at the All-Parliamentary All-Parliamentary Group for Penal Affairs or Women's Affairs yesterday, which was chaired by Baroness Corston, we had the head of Magistrates Association, and the questions we were asking is, why are so many women sent to prison when that could have been avoided? So looking at it from a preventative measure, the magistrates were saying that, first of all, they do not, sometimes when they're sentencing, the reports that they have on the people are too short, so they don't have the whole story. And there is something that they want to do, that they have they have been told by some other groups, probation and other groups, that they cannot do it. Then also, if they were to use women's centres, they sometimes do not even know where those women's centres are, or the list. And we were saying that there were so many lists available, there are places, but there doesn't seem to be some joined up thinking in some of those areas, which I think maybe we can promote and support. But the other issue as well was, apparently they have some orders, I don't know the right names for them, some of you here might know, but they can use some mental health orders or something.
Treatment orders.
Yeah, treatment, that's correct, thank you, Dr. Phillip. And this, they can use them, but they said they don't use them very often, because sometimes they don't even know when they can use them or how to use them. And maybe they were thinking along the lines of some training or that sort of thing. So how can we help them do this? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there are pilots, Milton Keynes, West Midlands, with mental health treatment orders, drug treatment orders, where we're seeing some really good work being done in terms of trying to divert women away and getting the right treatment. Work in progress, because the biggest challenge is the mental health services in Britain are always under pressure. This is a legacy of governments of all political colours over many, many decades. I can count on one hand the number of times I've spoken to a psychiatrist as a doctor in my life. It's writ large across the country. Some areas are better than others in terms of providing these services. The problem is that the DH quite rightly has an equitable access thing, whether you're an offender or non-offender. And so when you're trying to deal with a group who have a significant burden of mental illness, it's difficult to get local services to concentrate on them in front of others. Okay, that's the practical challenge. But we now have. When I turned up, there wasn't much of a relationship between MOJ and DH, to be blunt. Okay, we now do have a relationship, and there's a lot more going on, a lot of work going on between the two departments in order that we try to align the services with the need of women offenders, both in the community and indeed in custody.
Well, I mean, the example I gave before is a really good example of the Pathways project that we've got in the City of York, which is a combination of the Mental Health Trust, the social services from the council, the police, and the CCGs working together to really try and support people into services that really get them into the services. That isn't linked up yet with the sort of criminal justice process, if you like, but we know the people who are in that service have a very high rate of offending, and that we can see those offending rates coming down. So in terms of prevention, we know that holistic support for people, looking at solving, providing proper support for those people works. The question is, how do we then link that up with our criminal justice system? I would say we do that through the local criminal justice boards, because all of the partners are sat around the table at those criminal justice boards, and we can link those up at a local level. So there are the mechanisms to do it.
I think the other piece, just to add, I suppose, is certainly when I've gone around and visited a lot of the women's centres, and some of them sort of pre-transforming rehabilitation were very well plugged in actually with the courts and the sentencing and the pre-sentence report writers. And so one of the things we have seen most recently, obviously with TR, is that sort of erosion or corrosion or just complete diminution of that effect. So that's something in terms of this work, but also our future probation work, that would be a key part of our thinking.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Rory said, because when you were saying that, Danielle, I was thinking, a few years ago before TR, we used to have regular visits of the magistrate, have really, really good relationships. They were really familiar with what was on offer to them in terms of disposal at our women's centre when we used to run a female offence specified activity requirement and the rehabilitation activity requirement. And that's kind of lessened over time. And also the other thing I just want to say is that it's really important nationally and locally, and I think this is what the direction of travel, it seems, is not just to see the women that we work with as the responsibility of the Justice Department. They're the responsibility of health, and the relationship between justice and health is really, really important, both nationally and locally.
I think just before I release you back into the wild, it would be great to hear your reflections.
Let me stand. These sorts of events are really good for me, in that I sort of take away the enthusiasm and also the genuine concern, the compassion, the desire to do things better, so that these women can have better lives, better futures. And so thank you, Centre for Social Justice, for organising it, for producing this report. As I said earlier, I'm sort of tired of talking, to be honest with you. I actually want to do. As you might detect, there is a sense of just being on the cusp of producing the strategy, and that's literally where we are. We've been there for a month or two. What I can promise is that there is a really strong desire to keep women out of prison. That there is a strong desire to reduce the number of women in prison. That if we are going to hold them in prison, they're going to be held closer to home. That if we can avoid holding them in prison, we'll be putting them somewhere else. That a holistic approach that brings in together health and justice is the right way forward. That if I can devolve, I will devolve. I hope all of that you like. I hope that you appreciate the direction of travel that I'm trying to set. I am the longest standing minister in the Ministerial Justice, and I'm under no illusions that I'm going to be seeing a fourth Secretary of State. But if I can leave one legacy, it will be in this area. I have plenty of responsibilities, but this particular area I've sort of invested most in. primarily because it was obvious that it needed it. I hope I can deliver something which you will be pleased about. You might not get everything you want, but at least see that I'm sort of on your side. Thank you very much for your time, for your positivity, for the contributions from the panel, particularly with all due respect to the other two from Rose, because I always like to hear from people who are at the front line. It's really striking actually as I've travelled across the country, and I've been to virtually every women's prison, and I've been to quite a few women's centres. The people at the front line, the ones that are actually delivering the care, the services, the dealing directly on a day-to-day basis, hand to hand with the women concerned. I learn the most from them, and that's where actually all ministers should do their work and spend their time. It's not round here, trust me. It's not good for your health. So thank you very much, and safe journey home to where you.